BCS ISSG BT Security Day in Birmingham at 3 Snow Hill. Today we've got a list of speakers from BT lined up to talk about security and privacy. First of all, we'd have Dave Harcourt talking on secure by design, followed by Rob Partridge talking on offensive security. And then we'll have a coffee break. And then that will be followed by Bob Slay, who's going to talk about agile ways of working securely. And then that's followed by James Bowling with a presentation on privacy in a telecoms world. And then after that, we'll have a panel discussion, which is open. We'll take questions from the Zoom audience. And then we'll have a closing talk, closing from the acting chair, Steve here, and from Dave Harcourt, our technical security director. We can hand over to Steve from BCS.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. This is a bit of a first for us at the ISSG in terms of running a hybrid event. Normally, of course, we do all of these things face to face, but we thought it was about time with all that had been going on with COVID that we try and do something hybrid. And I'm assured by our colleagues over here that BT have got this all sussed. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here at 3 Snow Hill. The facility for those of you who are on Zoom is absolutely fantastic. So if we run a future event, and I very much hope we do, if we run a future event here, then please do make sure that you manage to make it here, because this is one of the premier BT locations these days in the country. It really is top notch. So it falls to me to tell you a little bit about the BCS and the ISSG, just to put this into context. Whilst this is a partnership event, I have to say it's BT that's doing all of the heavy lifting here, because they provided the facilities, they provided the technology, and as you will see from the agenda, they provided all of the speakers as well. But it's going to be a fantastic event. So a little bit about BCS. BCS has been around since around 1957. And I was refreshing my memory on the train on the way here this morning. And there's an interesting little summary of what BCS has been doing over the past, well, in 10-year chunks up until the present time. And of course, they started out 1957. These days, they've got round about 60,000 members spread across 150 countries, unbelievably. I'm not sure where they all are. I'm assuming most of them are here. So if you're not already a BCS member, either on the Zoom call or here in the room, then highly recommended. It is the Chartered Institute for IT for a very good reason. So if you're not signed up, then please come and talk to us. We'd love to have you on board. As far as the ISSG is concerned, the ISSG is one of around about 45 or 50 specialist groups that are set up to deal with particular aspects of IT. And of course, the BCS stands for making IT good for society. So that's really what drives us, is to make IT good for society. And of course, to enable us to do that, security obviously fits in underpinning all of that. So what was interesting when I was reading the summary of what the BCS has been doing over all of these years was the first mention of security and cyber was in the 10-year slot that started in 2010. So it's as if security has only just started, which is bizarre, isn't it? Because BCS has been mirroring the development of computing all the way through, but the first mention of security comes in 2010. However, we're going to change all of that today, we hope. We're going to make it a very, very interesting and interactive session. We've got 4 fantastic speakers lined up to talk about how BT sees security within IT. And I was also thinking on the way here that if I had £1 for each time somebody told me that, you know, that horrible data breach that's going to happen, it's not if, it's when. Well, I'm not quite sure I quite believe that. I think it very much depends on lots and lots of factors. And one of the key factors, of course, is what you do at the start and how you build your IT systems, how you do your architecture, your design, and then, of course, how you operate them. So for me, it can never be a given that it's always not if, but when. It very much depends on some of the things that we're going to be talking about here today. So I'd like to welcome Dave Harcourt to lead us off talking about secure by design. Thanks, Dave.
Steve.
Thank you.
Boy, round of applause. Good afternoon, and from me, for those who are in the room and for those who are remote, welcome to Snow Hill as well. As Steve was saying, this is one of our latest buildings. It is really high tech. It's a future, what we call our better workplaces that we are building out across the country. So if we're not going to host here, we've got one Bram open in London as well. Equally brilliant. The event facilities, unfortunately, in one Bram are on the ground floor, not the top floor. So you don't get the stunning views that you get if you come here to Snow Hill. And it is a stunning view across Birmingham. If there ever is a stunning view across Birmingham, but it's a great panoramic view. If anyone here hasn't seen the views, I do recommend going over up. We've got a balcony over the side. You can actually go and look over Birmingham. It's not a brilliant day, but please go do that. Anyway, secure by design. I'm not going to actually slideshow you to death with slides. I've got 3 slides I want to talk through because actually they cover a bunch of topics that I want to focus on. So hopefully this is going to work. I'm going to start talking about some of the challenges. And I think if we look back, and this is going to reflect maybe on some of Steve's comments here, if we look back at a policy standards led approach to security, because that's generally what many organizations have done. You stand up a set of policies, you put a set of standards together, you ask the teams, or you expect teams who are implementing things to take those policies and standards and implement good security as part of building the stuff that they build. And that's great. When you start on that process, right, you think we're embedding security in because we've got people thinking about stuff. The challenge with just taking that approach is it leads to a bit of a chaotic mess. So this is why I've got a picture of spaghetti. Because actually when you start and then understand and get some assurance about what's happening, you try and put some wrap around that from an operations perspective. What you find is you've put these requirements in place as to how people need to do stuff, but you've got 15 different ways of solving the same problem. And you're trying to then look at understanding how all those various different bits hang together. And it's really difficult to understand that. It's really difficult to get a degree of assurance of the security that's actually been put in place. And from an operations perspective, you're trying to understand what's going on in the, in your environment, your IT environment or your network environment. And you're trying to tackle through all of these various different elements. And that becomes even harder in organizations as they morph and change. We acquire other organizations, we bring them in, and we've got elements of organizations still working in the way that they've kind of worked before. That for us has led to a very complex environment and very complex way of working without that kind of overall direction about actually what the security capabilities kind of should look like in an organization. Just to give you a number, so we've been looking at the breadth of the kind of that diversity across our security capabilities, and we've got over 220 different security capabilities that have been built in a variety of different ways, 6 or 7 different vulnerability management solutions where, again, data is not brought together in a way that we can holistically look across the piece. So those sort of things really give you a challenge when you're trying to get that robust understanding about how good your security is. And of course, those open little doors for people to sneak into, for when Rob's going to talk to us about offensive stuff in shortly, and all of those little nooks, crannies, doors are great ways for people to kind of get in. So how do we address that? Importantly, so turning spaghetti into something that's a bit more ordered. So lasagna, that's the same sort of food, same sort of stuff, but actually now in some form of structure and order. So clearly policies and standards and all those things are still important because good governance drives us to have those in place. But what it needs as well to bring that order together is some sort of authoritative direction. Looking at an overall picture of a security target architecture, direction, and making it simple and easy to adopt that architecture so that you put in place guidance, you put in place guardrails, you put in place patterns and even anti-patterns about what not to do. So avoid doing these sort of things. Please do adopt these sort of things. And of course, making those things really simple and easy to adopt by the organization. So security is easy if it's the path of least resistance. So how do we make doing good security simple and easy for the organization? So it doesn't want to avoid it, it wants to adopt it because actually, we make it simple and easy. And part of that is also then driving out, kind of knowledge and awareness of the right approaches to use and driving that into the organization. So again, it's simple and easy to use. And I know Bob will probably come back and talk about this later on when he touches on the agile work we've been doing and our guide to trust verify approach. But more on that from Bob later. I won't steal Bob's thunder. So from a team perspective, right, and this is me talking really about now the approach that I've been pulling together for the last 2 years in bringing some of that order into the direction. And we're at the start of a journey. It's a long journey that I foresee us being on for the next 3 to 4 years as we continue to drive out a better overall target architecture. So starting at that top with that target architecture position, using that architecture to drive implementation of a number of strategic security capabilities. So replacing the 221 different capabilities we've got with a much more structured set of standard capabilities that are then leveraged and used across the whole of the organization. From those security capabilities, putting in place patterns about how to consume those capabilities. So again, we make it simple and easy. So coming back to making that, driving that path of least resistance to make adopting security a simple and easy thing to do. So that's the architectural piece across the top. It's establishment of patterns. But then the other important point from a secure by design perspective, right, it's in the name, secure by design. How do we ensure that as the organization is driving transformational things, we're embedded into that conversation? We're part of the understanding of risk, and we're part of understanding how the solutions are put in place. So we run around the life cycle of building something. We run a business level triage and a process that we internally call Passport. So Passport is designed to intercept the things that are higher risk the organization is doing and provide some degree of assistance to that. So yes, we've got some patterns and patterns that can drive the organization to help to consume those sort of elements. But also as well as that, we provide additional security consultancy support to really provide expertise. So when there's something new the organization's doing, where there's a place where we maybe not have a pattern, or we're adopting different technologies, all those things where we want to put some additional expertise in to help make sure that we get those things right. Adding that consultancy into that point and then driving through the whole design life cycle as things iterate through that design life cycle to ensure that by the time we come to launch, we've got a clear risk or clear set of residual risks, and we've managed that risk down with the organization as much as we can do. And of course, one of the important feedback loops is as we're doing this, and especially when we're driving through new technologies, we may be at a point where we realize that we've got some gaps in our architecture. We've got some things we need to do that we don't have solutions for. And that provides feedback back in to the architectural position to say, we need to fill this hole here strategically with something new that we've not built before, and provides and closes a kind of whole loop between what we're doing from a design perspective and how that feeds all together. And underpinning all of that, whilst I don't have it on board, we have a compliance stream that drives through this whole space, intended to automatically capture the status of what actually is implemented out there, so we can get some confidence around that whole assurance of what's been put in place from a solutions perspective, knowing that it's complying to our policies and our controls that we expect. With the capabilities that we put in place here, actually being able to measure the status of some of those controls as well, and ensuring that we're on top of those. So that's the journey. That's a bit about why we're doing it and some of the what's that through the work we're doing, we're hoping to achieve through that process. At that point, I'm going to thank you very much. It's the end of my presentation for today. Are we doing some questions as we go, or do you want to, how are we handling any cues around it? Any questions?
Not at the moment, then, eh?
This is where we enjoy the fun of virtual events. We have one over here. Someone's got a mic, Rob.
Question?
What happened to all the paper?
What happened to all the paper? Which paper are we after? Is there any paper in the process? No, there's no paper in the process. Why would you want paper these days, right? So no, I mean, the whole process we've got is built around, you know, electronic systems capabilities that we've got. You know, we've got tools that support this whole process from end to end. Paper is. But when you started, it was paper. When we started, it was paper. I mean, you wind back a long, long time ago, right? And we used to have everything used to be written down, absolutely. But I think most organizations, if you wind back far enough, started with writing documents and having things signed off and faxed. I even remember the days when we used to fax stuff around, right? Yeah, dead and buried. It's definitely gone in this world of paper. So if anyone's still using paper, get off paper, do it electronically. Because actually, if you want to, I mean, that, you know, it's a very important point, right? You want to get some assurance around stuff. If everything's written down on paper, how do you get any assurance that you can understand the status of it? You have to turn this into a world of electronics and digitize it. Any questions online?
Yeah, I've got a question, Dave, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
So smaller organizations, obviously not the size and scale of BT, struggle with governance just because of the amount of time and effort that needs to go into doing it well, doing it properly. How much time and effort goes into some new thing that you're doing in terms of getting it through all of these gates?
That's a very interesting question, actually. It kind of depends on the scale and size, unfortunately. I mean, this is one of those it depends answers. It's you know, almost like a piece of string. So, you know, if we've got something small, you know, something small, and probably I've actually got one of my consultants, Ish could probably even help us with an answer to that one to rope people in off the floor. But I think you know, if we've got a small piece of activity, it's quite lightweight. And we ask to do this triage, right? We ask 7 questions, 7 pretty simple questions that of the solution that someone's doing and building out, trying to understand what is it you're doing, what's the impact of it, is it simple, is it straightforward, is it something you just get on with and you don't need some assistance from, or is it something that actually we need to engage and spend more time and effort helping you with? And the process isn't a tick box process, right? We're not just measuring something at one stage and giving it a tick and saying you're fine. If it's something that needs a consultant, the consultant is there through the life cycle of a program. And some of those programs could be, well, I mean, in fact, some of them, if you think back to the speed at which we had to respond to COVID, some of those projects and programs were days long. Some of them are weeks, some of them run for months. Because of a big major program, we could be sitting and working with a big major program for months and years as we're driving that whole program through. Think about building out a 5G core network, right? It's a big effort and requires a lot of effort through this process to ensure that we continue to get that right. So, but I think for a small organization, you can make this lightweight. And it's made easier by having capabilities out there, having good guidance about how to adopt them. Because if you've got guidance and you've got simplicity about how you do stuff, then actually this is a very lightweight process. And that's our drive, is to share that. You know, we talk about sharing knowledge, enabling the business to do its own security by sharing that knowledge out, by putting patterns in place, by making those patterns easy to adopt, easy to integrate. Then it becomes very simple for the business to get security right and just do the right thing. And that's our goal at the end of the day. Got another question? Got Alan?
Well, it's not from me.
I know, yeah, you're playing proxy. I get that.
Yeah, I'm playing proxy. Well, Dave, you've got 2 questions from Conrad. So what software assurance do you use? And where do data privacy impact analysis come into it?
Okay, maybe I shall hold. Maybe can we hold the data privacy conversation maybe for James to pick up later on in his slot, because it's an ideal question for James to cover. From a software assurance point of view, we have a variety of different tools that we're leveraging within that. So we've got a GRC orientated tool that's running, and I'm going to avoid vendors, right? Because if we get into the specific vendors, it feels like I'm favoring and talking about one vendor, but we've got a GRC orientated tool that's driving our overall compliance picture. We've got, to support passport as a process, we've got a workflow orientated tool that's supporting bringing data in and then tracking that through the implementation process. As an organization that is moving towards cloud and adopting cloud first, we're leveraging cloud orientated tools, which I think for us is a really great way of actually moving forwards. Enables us then to leverage some of the latest industry capabilities and evolve in that way that industry is evolving. So hopefully that answers that question, Conrad.
I've just got one more. We've got a couple of folks on the Zoom call asking if we're going to be able to share the slides. I think I know the answer, but just wanted to check with you first.
There's nothing, I always assume, especially when you're doing a hybrid event with Zoom, that someone's probably going to be screen capturing anyway. Yeah.
That's great.
So yeah, I don't have a problem sharing the slides.
Super. Thanks very much. Does that go for the other speakers as well, just before I get asked? Yeah. So we will be sharing the slides from all 4 presentations this afternoon on the ISSG website. Thanks very much. Cheers.
So there's no more questions. I mean, we can always come back to any more. Oh, so I've got one in the room. Okay, so the question, I'll just repeat it. Do we get involved in threat modeling techniques? So absolutely. I mean, I think one of the important elements of what we do, so especially in the bigger elements of work, is that actually how do we do threat modeling in a way of understanding what those threats are, what those attack routes are, right? So we're maturing what we do in that space. We are today not consistent. We're moving towards an attack tree orientated model of understanding and recording what we do in that space, so that we've got some, well, not only consistency, right, but actually the decisions we're making, why we made that choice, is actually structured and recorded as well for later use. Because if you're coming back to many iterations of the same type of infrastructure, we build on that as it evolves and grows. It's good to be able to go back to the original decisions that were made and why were those decisions made. So yeah, absolutely, it's an evolving piece. Attack tree is kind of the methodology we're looking to follow in that area. Cool. So any more questions? Well, I mean, we've got the panel session later. I imagine we can come back to anything later on if it grows, in which case I shall be handing over to Rob.
It's not if, it's when, because if you're up against these guys, then it probably is when. But I think the point was well made that all of the work that Dave and his team do about building secure systems, doing your process, doing your governance, getting it as right as you possibly can. And then the other point about, keep testing it, don't let go of the details, because it's probably some of those smaller details that are going to let these guys in. If you keep all of that in focus, then you stand a fair chance of reducing the risk. And it's all about reducing the risk, isn't it? Because we do, as information security professionals, understand that you can never get rid of all of the risk. You can only do so much so far. And Dave, you talked about residual risk. And residual risk is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because I've yet to come across anyone who is prepared to say, oh yeah, I can accept that level of residual risk, particularly if you try and put a number against it. So residual risk is a concept rather than a definitive statement, in my head at least. Anyway, thanks ever so much to the two of you for all of that. That's been terrific. We're going to stop for a coffee break now. Rob, how long have we got for coffee? I think we're a little early, aren't we?
A little early, but if we have 20 minutes for coffee, we can start the next bit a bit earlier.
A little earlier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you folks who are on Zoom, we're going to have a 20-minute break at this end. We're going to enjoy a coffee. You probably will too. And we'll see you back here at about 20 to 3. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Super. Well, we've been chatting in the break here, and the last couple of speakers have given us all huge amount of food for thought. It's been really, really useful, really good. Bob is now going to talk about agile ways of working securely. Over to you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks very much. I think we'll all have found that last talk incredibly interesting. It's always terrible following these guys trying to do a talk after they've talked about the bank jobs and things like that. But I'm going to try my best. Yeah. So I'm a strategic transformation consultant. I work in Dave's area. If you have knowledge, let others light their candles in it. And I think I'm here today really to share my knowledge, but also hopefully to get some knowledge back from the attendees today to help inform my work. So in Dave's area, he's talked about the fact that we do passports. It's an assurance, a security design assurance process. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm a little bit nervous today. It's been a long time since I did a presentation. So Passport has been really a very successful approach within BT, perhaps a little too successful for its own good. It shone light into dark, shadowy areas of BT and brought it out in order for us to do assurance on it. So it's been a challenge to keep up with the demand that's coming out of the business for the assurance services that we provide. And we've managed to achieve that by doing an awful lot of continuous improvement, reworking the way we do. And still we're running pretty high levels of capacity in use. And then in order to stay ahead of that game, it's critical, and this has been part of my role, to be out amongst the business, understanding what's coming next. And a couple of years ago, got involved with a couple of projects that were causing a bit of problem in the space, demanding that we gave them consultants that needed to sit in the sprints that they were doing. So this was agile, and I went out there and tried to work out what the scale of this work was going to be coming from the business. And I think it would be fair to describe it really as an agile stampede that was coming over the horizon towards us. So clearly we're running nearly at capacity. It's very difficult to see how we can take on this the whole extra demand working the way we do. So we had to look at strategic transformation. And I think when we step back, we have to look at what it was the business was really asking us to do. So these are big asks. BT are on our digital journey, yeah, and we're asked, many departments within BT, to align with the demands of the business. So adaptability is in our bloodstream. We've got very good at changing the way we operate in order to support the business. But what we're being asked here, we want to support new operating models. It's a big ask. Achieving business value, sooner, safer, happier, another big ask. Building a scalable, flexible, autonomous, collaborative model, all those great words, another big ask. And in the end up, what the business really wanted us to do was create a long-lived cross-functional security team aligned to value and customers. But it's more even than that. Our business has to take a fearless approach to move on in the marketplace. And yet we need to make sure that it stays safe. So how do we do that? Well, when we see our CEO charging at full speed towards a cliff, our job in security is not to say, stop, you can't do that, but to run alongside them and explain to them that if we carry on along this same path, we're all going to go off that cliff together. And that actually we can guide them in such a way as to avoid the cliff, but still get to the same destination, but in a safe manner. So that image for me, I tried to build up an image of what we were trying to achieve here. And I think this is about guiding the business. And if you want to improve the way that you perform, let's say as an athlete, you go and you get a personal trainer who helps you develop. So, and I think there's a clear message here that we need to have security personal trainers within the wider business to ensure that secure by design is being taken care of at the sharp end. So that's still not enough, because the business actually wants us to become, the strategy is to be the world's most trusted connector of people, devices, and systems. So just having a personal trainer is not enough. We still need that, but we need to go that extra step, and we need to really reframe security, the practice that we have as being an elite coach, you know, to really get the best out of our business, to perform at the level that the business is asking us to do. So these are all really big asks, and it's going to be a challenge. So how do we approach it? So a number of you, has anybody heard of DHOC? No, I'm guessing not. Most people haven't. He talks about a thing, chaotic organizations. Yeah. And what we find when we look at a big problem, what I tend to find, if you look at things like, you know, nature has dealt with bigger problems than this and has found highly efficient ways of dealing with producing organizations that function very well and with the minimum amount of waste. So, you know, it's things like being self-organizing and having just enough order to stay on the edge of chaos, which really is a thought that's really resonated with me ever since I've been in BT. And this guy even invented a word for it, chaotic, putting together chaos and order, you know, and talking about things that harmoniously blend those characteristics together to achieve things. So if you're going to have a chaotic organization, there are things that you need to do differently, you know, and in particular, look, he considered how you do leadership, and he used an old definition, I think from a Scottish dictionary, I think it was, about a leader not being a commander, somebody who stands there and tells people what to do, but being somebody who goes before and shows the way. Yeah? And by doing that, you start to bring out all sorts of latent things out of the people that you're working with. He goes a step further in terms of how we should approach this. His guidance is that you should lead yourself, because you need to be doing these things right. You should lead your superiors, because when you know what direction you want to go in, they're the people who are able to say, yeah, let's go that way. And you lead your peers, because you can't deliver things without the support of your peers. And then that doesn't really leave you much time for the people who are working for you. And the answer to that is just simply to employ good people, free them to do the same as you freed yourself to do, and everything else is trivia. Yeah. So who is DHOC? You know, you haven't heard of him, but you have certainly heard of the organization that he created, and you've probably used that organization today, probably without even thinking about it, because DHOC founded Visa, which he describes as the world's premier system for the global exchange of value. And the figures there, you know, tell the story, yeah, about what these people are doing. And the amazing thing about Visa is that you don't think about it. It's an incredibly complex beast, but you go and you pay your credit card bill, or you buy your beer or your food or whatever with your Visa card. You don't consider all that complexity behind that's hidden. You know, and it's very much the same as, you know, when you take a drink of water, you don't consider all the complexity that there is behind getting that glass of water to you. You know, the water cycle is nature's premier system for the global exchange of life. Yeah? And in both these, particularly in the Visa thing, there is this incredible level of trust that's built up, not just you as an end customer, but when you look at the vendor who, you know, you buy your Christmas shopping online, you know, there's everybody's trusting that everyone's going to get paid, you're going to get the goods. And that's the simplicity of what you get there masks all that complexity that manages to build up enormous levels of trust. So that's DHOC. And in order to, how do we move towards that idea of leadership and that idea of building chaotic organizations? I want to talk now about David Marquette. I don't know whether people have heard of David Marquette either, but he was the captain of a US nuclear submarine called the Santa Fe. He spent a whole year training how to run a nuclear submarine. And then the Navy shipped him off to a submarine, but they shipped him off to a different class of submarine from the one that he'd spent a year learning how to use. Yeah. So he found himself in charge of this nuclear submarine, running a load of trials and tests before they were ready to put out to sea. And one day he ordered that they went to 2/3 forward power on the electric motor. And the officer on deck issued the order and the helmsman responded and nothing happened. So he said, hang on a minute, I gave an order, what's happening? And the helmsman said, well, we don't have 2/3 power on this submarine on the electric motors. Yeah? So he turns to the officer on deck. Why did you tell him to do it? He said, well, because you gave me an order. And my job is to pass the order along. Yeah. And he realized just how dangerous this was. I mean, this is in a nuclear submarine, but it's dangerous in any place to have a commander without knowledge and a bunch of people who have been trained to blindly comply with what they're told to do. So he obviously set himself a challenge. How do you get around this? Yeah. And the thing that he developed was intent-based leadership. So he said, I'm never going to give another order. That's not quite true. He said the only orders that he was going to retain were the orders to fire missiles. Yeah, that was his responsibility alone. Yeah, but all the rest of it, he would give his intent. You know, we need to go and watch out for this submarine coming through this part of the sea. Yeah, and then he would ask his people, how did they intend to make that happen? And those guys would then, you know, first of all, they'd say they were doing that, and then a while, you know, when they got in the hang of doing that kind of thing, he'd start to say, okay, when they tell him what they intended to do, he'd say, so what do you think I'm thinking? You know, and they'd say, oh, well, I think you must be thinking safety. You know, so here's my safety checklist for dive. And in moving down that way, he built an amazing submarine crew who previously they'd been very high level of attrition in the crew. They never ever wanted to stay. He ended up getting the best scores. It took a couple of years, you know, it took 2 years to fully implement it. But he said from the first 24 hours, you could see a difference in the way that his crew responded. They were actually, you know, he provided psychological safety for them to be able to say, okay, I know I've been trained to blindly do whatever I'm told to, but actually I can think. Yeah. Move the authority to the information. The guys in the crew actually knew what was going on in the submarine. Yeah? They didn't need the guy at the top giving them commands. They just needed to be given the ability to think for themselves. And that really was what he did. He created the environment for thinking. And his argument was, I've got 135 people in this submarine. It doesn't matter how big my brain is. It doesn't matter how much thinking I do. I cannot think and come up with good answers as well as 135 people can. And so creating that environment for thinking was what he achieved. And I think the lesson from this is, you know, it's not about taking control and creating followers. It's about giving control and creating leaders at every level of the organization. And clearly to be able to do this, you know, it's perhaps in some ways easier to see in the closed system of a submarine. But, you know, you do things, you need to make sure that the people are competent to do the tasks that they're being asked to do. And again, in the Navy, probably not a problem. A little more challenging, I would suspect, in most companies. And you need to again give them the clarity of what is the intent, what is it we're trying to achieve here? And then let them do their stuff. So when we understand the direction we're trying to go in and the way we're trying to do the leadership, this diagram, a very complex diagram, and I've struggled to try to explain it to people, but you've got basically, it's a map. It's called the Kuniwin Framework. It's spelt strangely because it's a Welsh word, and it means roughly speaking, it means habitat. But it's one of those great words that kind of has built into it that the idea that it's describing, that it's a label for, cannot actually be fully described in words. Yeah. So it's a bit of a challenge trying to explain it to you, but it tries to give you a map for you to understand the environment you're in, to be able to make appropriate decisions and head in the right direction. So you've got it split up into 5 areas. So you've got chaotic, complex, complicated, clear, and in the middle, confused. And the idea is that you try to identify which of these, when you've got a problem, you try to identify which of these 5 areas you're in so that you can adopt the right approach. The confused bit in the middle is when you don't know. Yeah. And the idea then is that you're probably looking at too big a problem. Break it down into pieces and work out which each of those pieces sits in. And I tried to think of a way to kind of bring this model, because I've only just started studying this, but I think this is an amazing tool that I'm going to get enormous use out of over the years. So I was trying to work out how best to explain it. And then I realized that I think the COVID crisis is probably a good example here. So when it first started a couple of years ago, it was all novel practices. Nobody knew any of the answers. They didn't even really know what the questions were a lot of the time. So when you're in that space, there's nothing you can do apart from act, because there is no good practice to follow. So you act, and then you sense your environment, and then you respond to that, and then and if you're still in that chaotic space, you continue to do that until it becomes clear what you're doing. So I think that's the very beginning. When it became clear that vaccines were the way forward from all that kind of acting within that novel space, then things moved into the complex space, where you're looking for emergent solutions that come out of all of that complexity. So you do a load of trials to try and build vaccines and test them and things. And I mean, this is the space where Agile sits, where there are emergent practices is the word I use. This is a very, this diagram has been around since 1990. It was created by a guy called Dave Snowden, who worked for IBM. Yeah. He now runs a company that based on this sense-making framework. So the Agile stuff sits in that space, and there you're probing and sensing and responding. So lots of trials, lots of experiments, keep going round and round until it starts to make sense. And I think that vaccine creation was there. Then you move over to the complicated area where there are good practices. So now when you found the vaccine that you need to roll it out in scale. So this is where you can build factories to turn out vaccines. It's not simple. It's still an incredibly complicated thing that you have to do. But now you can sense the environment, you can analyze it and work out how to respond. And then when you've built up your vaccine and you need to put it in people's arms, well, we've been putting vaccines in people's arms. We've been putting things in people's arms for hundreds of years, I'm guessing. So really, there's best practices in this space. You don't need to do a great deal of thinking about it. This is the sort of, you're moving down this right-hand side when you're talking about design patterns, and being able to do repeatable stuff. So I think that, like I say, I'm only just starting to scratch the surface of this, but I find it incredibly interesting. In fact, I just bought the book. They brought out a book recently, and I had to leave it at home so that I wasn't reading that rather than concentrating on building these slides so I could talk to you, because I'm looking forward to when I get home and reading some more about it. So I think that helps us to identify, I used this, first of all, just in my own head to understand, because the Agile stampede that was coming over the horizon towards us, everything was going to be Agile. No, everything's not going to be Agile, because it doesn't make sense to do everything Agile. It makes sense in that emergent area, in that chaotic space. So the chaotic space sits in that complex space on the boundary between complex and chaotic. And that's where your truly innovative work happens. That's where your Agile practices need to be developed. You don't need them. In the complicated space, we do lean. We make it an efficient process to do design and assurance and stuff. We don't do Agile in that space. And this helped me make sense of that. So I could then go back to the business and say, no, really, you're never going to do all of this Agile. Yeah, So I like that framework. I think it's an interesting one. I hope people find it useful going forwards. I think I will. So where did we get to at the end of all this when we rolled it all together? So Dave's already given away the secret, but it's no great secret. So in order to enable the autonomy that our design community needs to operate at the speed that the business demands, we need to provide guidance for how to do secure by design. Yeah. Then we need to step back and trust that the business does what it's supposed to do, that it does all the right things, all the right times to meet all the stakeholders' requirements. And we are a stakeholder, you know, and they need to achieve compliance and all those great things, but we can't do that for them. They need to be doing that themselves. And then at the end of all that, we need to verify things because, you know, the business, as it develops excellent delivery engagement to deliver on this agile idea, they should be outputting the evidence that we need for assurance and compliance to verify that secure by design has actually been done. So what underpins this idea of guide, trust, verify? Well, in the guide space, there's two main areas. We need to create reusable solutions, the design patterns that Dave talked about earlier, and build up a body of security knowledge in the sharp end here, at the people who are actually doing the design. You know, secure by design, it can only happen where the design is happening. So we need to have the security skills where the design is happening. We got away with it in Waterfall for quite a while, but in Agile, with this constant iteration, very short cycles, we're never going to build up a consultancy team big enough to have a consultant in every sprint. It's just never going to scale. So we need to move the knowledge to where it needs to be. And then we start to build up this trust, and it doesn't happen overnight. It has to be earned. You know, we have to see that the business is doing these things right. It's driven by maturity. So as the business gets more and more used to, you know, it's still early in its agile journey, you know, and trying to get the secure by design approach fitted in is going to take time to grow. And what we're really trying to do here is make sure that we can accurately assess the levels of risk which is being taken on in those designs. And the way to do that is to improve the quality of the information that we're basing our risk-based decisioning on. And then when we understand, when that trust starts to build, we can start then to localize security decision-making, to move away from the sort of command and control approach and move that down into the business. And then we need to verify that it's happening. So this is about evidence in the assurance. So it relies upon quality artifacts. And I make a big point when I'm talking to the business that the quality artifacts need to be produced natively. I describe it. But what I mean by that is that the process that the business is running needs to produce the evidence directly. I don't want a bolt-on process where somebody has to go away and produce a document, not a piece of paper, but you know, a document to say that they've done something. It should just come out of the natural working, because again, that's the only way we're going to get to the agile kind of work. And those quality artifacts then provide us a level of auditability, so that when, and I do say when, not if, when we get breached, we have an audit trail. So we can, not so that we can determine who to kick, but so that we can determine how can we improve it going forwards? How can we put checks in place that mean that we don't create that vulnerability again? And at the end of that, recording the risk output so that the business understands the level of risk it's taking by deploying the design it decides to deploy. So how do we make that happen? So we've built a security guild structure within the business. And you can see it's split into two. The green part at the top, the security part, that sits with us. Yeah. The purple bit at the bottom sits in our business units. And we think here we've managed to build a model that's scalable enough to the size of BT. I mean, we employ 100,000 people. It may not be the biggest, but it's a big organization. So it's scalable enough to do that. And yet it's also flexible enough so that it meets the needs of each of our commercial units, because they all insist upon operating in different ways. And we need to be able to accommodate that. So here at the bottom level, the security champions, these are the guys in the squads who are actually doing the design work. Yeah. And the security champions are, I call them the security conscience of the squad. You know, it's somebody who's already in the squad who takes on the role of a security champion, maybe something like a team captain, you know, some sort of a level just responsible. And you know, we look for happy volunteers at this level, you know, because we need people to buy into it. The next level up, the security guardians, these are the personal trainers. These are the guys, this is a full-time role. They're not doing the secure by design, but they're making sure it's being done. And in this organization, what we're trying to achieve is that down there in the squad where good work is being done, we're understanding where the good work is. We're starting to build design patterns to say, it was good the way we did this, you know, and by using security champions, we can manage to spread that across the squad. the good approaches go up to the security guardians, who can then spread that across multiple squads, across the tribes within their commercial unit. And then the level above that, the elite coaches, these are still the consultant level people, the chapter leads we call them, and they're operating really at a commercial unit level. And they're taking the learning from commercial units and helping to spread that good quality operating methods and things across the more commercial units. And then at the top in the guild, you've got kind of like the governing body, you know. And what we're achieving here is to draw up all the good behavior and all the good knowledge and all the good skills from the bottom and spread that out across the business. And the guild is going out into the wider world and taking all the best practice from other areas, from other companies, from wherever we can find it, and feeding that back down. And you've got this continual flow, very similar to the water cycle that I touched on before, of security knowledge flowing up and down this structure. Yeah. And that then creates what we started off trying to achieve, a long-lived cross-functional security team aligned to value and customers. And I think if the model works, then maybe it expands and it becomes a safety team. You know, and we build in privacy, we build in fraud, we build in other areas that achieve the same kind of thing. So I think the thing I want you to take away, I mean, you know, we built a structure here and we're talking about it, okay. But this structure is not going to work in other bits. This is specific to the BT environment, you know, and when you look at this in your own organization, you really need to work out. So I don't think the learning from here that I'd like, the knowledge that I'd like to share is not so much about the structure that we've built, but about that thinking that was behind it, why we're moving in this direction. And I think if you take that from it, that's probably a more valuable learning thing. And I think what we're hoping to achieve here, what this, I believe, should deliver over time is to move from that security, that agile stampede that we talked about at the beginning, and turn that round into becoming an unstoppable wave of security best practice flooding through our business. And I think that's what I came to talk to you about today. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thanks. Stunned silence. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so one of the things that, I guess, from a security perspective, we've got our kind of comfort blankets, we've got our NISTs, our ISO 27001, and this kind of, I guess, we still want to utilize those things, but we're kind of on that kind of agile journey where that structural, that structure is, I guess, how do we kind of bring our information security colleagues into this agile space? Because as soon as you start saying, look, we need to apply this kind of governance and this side of things, then you know the agile side goes, well, hold on a minute, you're trying to slow this down. How do you kind of deal with that kind of people side of it, if that makes sense?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I mean, I think in terms of the guild structure that we looked at, I think we take that learning from things like ISO 27001 and make sure that, you know, the consultants know this stuff already.
Yeah.
You know, they're dealing with that. What we're trying to do here is to move to ensure that secure by design is being done well, and to ensure that the first level of assurance is being done by the business. Yeah. Within its own capability, you know, up to its own level of competence at any time. It's a process. Is that beginning to answer your question? I'm not sure it is.
I guess it's kind of I think there's a within the agile, you're talking about kind of things moving really fast, and I suppose you get scrum teams that kind of spin up. I guess the question in my mind is about is that there's a, I'm just trying to validate the question myself. I think there's kind of it's almost like a meeting of two two structures, if that makes sense, because you get the kind of the agile, everything has to happen really quickly, and it's kind of getting the two teams to meet together, if that makes sense.
I think it's a huge challenge. But I think we have to achieve it. The business is not going to stop. It's not going to slow down. So you either end up deploying insecure solutions, or you find a way to do it better, to allow that security knowledge to be used in that fast cycle. And I think that is the challenge we face. Does that help? I feel from your face, I'm not hitting the spot for you.
I think because I like the idea of the guild structure. I kind of get the idea of kind of people, you kind of get that security knowledge into the teams. And I think that's really important, because you kind of want the teams to be doing it kind of by themselves almost.
They have to, up to the level of, with some oversight from people who have the full set of skills of security knowledge and understanding.
And I guess it's that journey that you need to go through in order to get there, if that makes sense. So it's kind of where do you kind of start, because so I can tell you where we start. Okay. We start by recognizing that we're operating in that complex space. And we do trials, and we've been doing this now. Ish is here. He's been leading many of the trials in the business. And we try and we work with the business to try to understand what we can do. And it's a case of, I take one of my consultants who should be working on 20 odd pieces of work and providing guidance there, and I give them to the tribe, and I say, whatever you need, this man does it. It's not sustainable, because now I've got one less in the small team to do the rest of the business. So now let's run some trials and understand what level of skills you need in your environment to be able to deliver securely. Okay.
And then as that builds up, then I can take my resources away. And then I take those skilled resources and I move them somewhere else in the business, and we try it again. And it's all about that. It's adopting that agile mindset of we don't know the answer. We're still working it out with the business.
So I suppose I'm kind of just leading on that. So that there is an investment you have to make upfront there in order to in order to start the journey going, if that makes sense. Because you're talking about here, you got the hordes of kind of agile coming at you. You actually almost have to say, well, stop, I will put a security consultant in here to start that journey working in order to start moving forward, if that makes sense.
But I think you're also highlighting the point that I make in this one, and we didn't really talk about it during the presentation, is that there is an investment to be made, but it's not my investment. This is the business. The business wants to do 5 times more work twice as quickly. They need to, they're quite happy to go and bring developers in to do this. They need to just factor in that what they need is security guardians, and we need to build an education program to help them go along that journey. But we're not scaling up a central security team here, because it doesn't scale to run agile with a central team. It would be huge.
So again, it's about experiments. You start off an experiment in order to kind of work out how you start the journey.
Throw away the command and control approach.
Exactly.
Adopt this agile intent-based leadership type approach. Let those people in the business who generally want to do a good job, but maybe don't have the competence. So now we help provide the competence, either by bringing people in with skills or training up the people we've already got. And over time, you're right, it's a journey. Over time, we build that up. We get the trust starts to build, that we trust that this unit is actually delivering secure by design in a way that we can verify in a very light touch manner. And then you can enable the business to run at the speed. Well, the business can enable itself to run at the speed that it wants to.
That's great. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. No, thank you.
Yeah, but we've got 2 questions that are online. Conrad, again, thank you very much, Conrad. So Bob, do you publish your assurance to the client's customers of your software?
Do I sorry, can you read that again?
Do you publish your assurance to the client's customers of your software?
I think I'm not quite sure I understand the question again. So we do, at the end of the assurance process, we would expect there to be evidence that secure by design or secure by development in the case of code has been delivered. Yeah, that's not a secret document. You know, it's the business has produced it itself, so it already has visibility of it. Yeah, it's not a case of me publishing it to them, it's their documentation. What we're doing is assuring that they've adopted all the right, they've complied with all the right policies, that they've developed using secure development life cycles and all those good things. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question. I think.
But okay, we got another one. We've got Fraser H. He says, you talk about guidance standards, but what are your thoughts on Verify, and how can this be delivered or integrated into the way moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked a little about that, in that it needs to be produced by the business, the evidence for verification. Now we can work with them to ensure that, you know, so for example, in software development, you know, making sure that CI/CD pipelines are in place, you know, that the as much automated testing, because this is all about doing things efficiently, isn't it, really? You know, that enough automated testing is in place so that somebody doesn't have to go through and check every bit of code. Yeah, but recognizing that the automated test suites really are more like a spell checker for your code. You know, they're not going to find the problems that when you put that stuff out on your website or wherever that somebody may find a vulnerability in. You know, so yeah, I'm hoping that's answered the question, right?
Maybe I can help Bob on the latter bit on Verify, because I think come back to what I was talking about on secure by design earlier, right? And the tooling and the architecture piece to that as well. I think that's where that helps on the verification. So actually having an ability, somewhere I'm not here, actually having an ability to be able to measure what's going on across the estate provides the verification, right? So if you provide away from the speaker, if we provide the guidance to the organization to how to adopt things securely, and we've even got the tool sets around how to measure that in an effective way, that helps the verification, because we can actually see from an in-live compliance perspective that what the business has actually just implemented is actually the controls we expect to see are actually reporting into the overall kind of estate we've pulled together, the overall instrumentation of what we've put in place through the tool sets that we've got to try and measure compliance. So that helps the verification aspect of the work, rather than us having to go back to the challenge, going back to the point earlier about paper documentation, right? About having to actually look through a design and look through detail, because that's the biggest challenge. If you've got people trying to do that, you never scale it. We have to move towards a solution that is electronic, digitized, and then bringing that kind of knowledge off the estate that enables us to get that confidence that what's been implemented is actually following the controls that we actually expected to see. So I think that
thank you very much, Dave. Yeah, I think that's a clear answer. Are we done? They're happy with that answer. Excellent. Yeah.
I thought that was really good. And for me, we could talk about this, you know, sort of all day. It's one of those topics that could just go on and on and on. And it seems multi-dimensional in some ways. Largely, it's a culture change, isn't it? So to move from traditional waterfall to agile, your developers change their mindset. You know, they start thinking about minimum viable product, and then the security guys go, but is it going to be secure? And it's about pushing that knowledge and responsibility for security as far left as you
left in the
can.
Process and left far down in the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then also giving them the tools that they need to be able to demonstrate it, so that you can do the verification somewhere else, slightly independently. Yeah. But it's an absolutely fascinating topic, and I've seen it happen in our own organization, where we're predominantly waterfall and are now predominantly agile, and the mindset change that has gone on in the people to enable that to happen well has been absolutely astounding. You know, people who probably a few years ago neither thought nor cared much about security, all of a sudden are prepared to go, whoa, just a second, let's just stop and have a think about this. In the past, it would have been, yeah, just do it, someone else's problem. Not anymore, though. So it's really interesting.
It is a culture changer, and then that's why it takes time. You know, you can't do it. You could put some things in place immediately. You get a quick effect from implementing it well, but to get the full benefit, it does take longer. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? No. Thanks for him. Oh, sorry. Do we have a microphone, Rob?
Can you go back to the diagram? You had a big diagram there.
This one?
Yes. In your business units, you have the security champions and guardians and commercial unit. So you talked about some people who are learners or trainers. Where do they fall onto?
Yeah, so at this second level, the security guardians.
Security guardians.
Yeah, so they're the kind of personal trainers. These are the guys who help the squad to implement, to understand secure by design. They'll be doing the first line of assurance, effectively, you know, that we're moving that, the first line of assurance down into the actual business unit. There's concerns, you know, there's a number of concerns there, you know, separation of duties, obviously you have to make sure that's the case, but they're not left alone. You know, the chapter leads, people like, you know, Rob is one of our chapter leads and Ish is another one, you know, very, very highly skilled and experienced consultants who are keeping their finger on all of this. They're understanding, you know, what problems are coming up from the squad, what work they're attempting to do, you know, and it's about getting in, you know, when the business says, right, here's another load of work that's going to take us maybe a year to do. I think this is some of the advantages of the long-lived, you know, if you get this right with Agile, you actually end up with long-lived teams rather than project by project teams. So you're working with a set of people, you can build up that trust much better over time and understand what they're capable of. And then, you know, what you tend to find, I think, with people is that they exceed your expectations of them. If you get it right, if you give them the autonomy and the tools to do it, if you give control and create leaders is what you need to achieve, and
So,
it's not easy.
Am I correct to think this is a security sprint rather than every sprint, like you're doing the security in every sprint, or you're just looking at the sprint,
Okay,
the security side of it?
so I think
The security
I
team.
think to get the full benefits of it, they're doing security in every sprint. Yeah. Okay. Maybe one step on the journey is that you maybe do, you know, maybe some of the organizations want to have security items in their backlog as separate things. I don't think that's the full answer, but it's probably a good step along the way. I think the full answer is that they're considering security as an integral part of everything that they're developing. That's secure by design. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Any more for any more? Well,
No, that was brilliant, Bob. Thanks
Thank you
very
very
much
much.
indeed. Thank you.
cheers.
Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about privacy. So I'm just going to spend the last half hour up to the panel session talking a bit about the concept of privacy and how it relates to telecoms industry and the work and the products that we produce at BT. And I suppose the short answer is privacy really impacts just about everything that we do in telecoms. That's quite short for a half-hour presentation, so I'll try and sort of delve into it a little bit in a little bit more detail. But there's a number of different concepts that are sort of basically feeding into what we sort of call privacy in general, and derive from a lot of different areas of law and policy. I suppose we're looking at obviously data protection being perhaps the big one, but also human rights law, security related legislation. I'll talk a bit about that. Some criminal law, some law that relates to sort of individual rights of damages, that sort of thing for misuse of private information. And then last one, which is not really an area of law as such, but is a really big growth area at the moment, particularly for organizations like the Information Commissioner's Office, and that's data ethics. So moving really beyond just looking at personal data, for example, looking more widely at the morality of using data, how we use data, particularly in areas such as AI and big data, what the right way to use that data is, and how we can use it for good. And I guess coming back to Bob's presentation, the bit in the middle is probably the confusion. So coming back to the Kuniwin model that he was talking about. So we're trying to sort of unwrap some of that in terms of how it fits into the legal framework. And I thought I'd talk about three main areas, I suppose. Privacy and human rights, which is a big topic in media coverage, I guess. Data protection and GDPR. Again, GDPR, one of these pieces of legislation that even for non-lawyers has kind of invaded everyone's worlds and is a major part of a work that lots of major businesses, large and small, have been doing over the last few years. In that context, I'll talk a bit about Schrems 2, which again is one of those cases that a lot of non-lawyers have had to become aware of, unfortunately, because it impacts how we move data around, particularly for multinational companies, something that perhaps we need to unpick a little bit more. And then looking at perhaps my area of work, specifically investigatory powers and the Privacy International litigation that came out of the disclosures by Edward Snowden, which again, even if you're not involved directly in that area, lots of media coverage around it and a lot of public debate about the extent of investigatory powers and privacy in the last few years. I'll then move on just to talk a bit about telecom security specifically and the Telecom Security Act. A bit about, coming back to the area that Rob was talking about in such a fascinating way earlier, the area of offensive security and red teaming. And as you can imagine, for a lawyer like me, and I've worked with Rob's team, can be quite a challenging legal brief to get that kind of work to come across for a legal analysis and a legal wrap and policy guidance on it. So, but a really interesting area to get your teeth into. And then finally, sort of looking at a bit at product security, and then the area of data ethics, as I mentioned, which is a really big growth area. And I think sort of underpinning all of that is this tension between individual privacy and a lot of measures that are being taken to protect individual rights of privacy and individual data, and actually the impact that can have in terms of encryption and secure routes of communication on actually what we need to do at the wider network level to ensure security, which itself impacts on the privacy of users of the network, because there is a tension there and a rub between them. So let's just start perhaps by talking about where the legal concept of privacy comes from, because there isn't actually a UK law of privacy. It's drawn from various different areas. We've obviously got the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, a lot of people think that disappeared with Brexit. The European Convention on Human Rights has nothing to do with the EU. It's a treaty that's entered into by a number of countries known as the Council of Europe, but nothing to do with the European Union. It's basically a set of standards that people sign up to, and we stayed a member of that club after Brexit. And then, of course, the Human Rights Act, which incorporates that into UK law. So basically, it's taking those rights from this international treaty and stopping people from having to go to Strasbourg to sort of to litigate those rights or to enforce those rights. They can do that in the domestic courts. So that's where the Human Rights Act comes in. And Article 8 there protects the right to privacy and family life. And that's something that, particularly in the area of government work, needs to be, and legislation needs to be assured. But it is a qualified right. It's not, so we have certain rights that are absolute. The right not to be subjected to inhumane, degrading treatment is an absolute right. The right to privacy is one of those rights that's called a qualified right, and that means that you can interfere with it in certain areas as long as it's necessary and proportionate to do so. And that's where some of the legal issues come up in the areas such as investigatory powers, which we'll come on to talk about in a moment. We've then got retained EU law, and that is actually law that is relating to the European Union and members of the European Union. And some of that we have basically sort of frozen in time at the point of Brexit, and we've kind of kept some of that. And part of that, which is the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, also gives some rights in relation to privacy. We've got a bit of English law that sort of predates all of this, which also relates to privacy, such as the right not to have your private information misused. And where a lot of you will probably be aware of that from the last few weeks is that's what the Duchess of Sussex has been relying on in her litigation against Associated Newspapers, that they published this letter from her to her father, and that was a misuse of her private information. And then a bit on criminal law as well. So Communications Act offences, persistent use of messaging to harass people, Protection from Harassment Act as well, also impact on people's rights to a private life. But I'd say it's probably the main area that in telecoms we're looking at, in addition to the human rights themselves, is GDPR and data protection. And where that sits in terms of human rights is it sort of sits on top of the human rights framework. So you'll see a lot of human rights related language in GDPR, such as the need to act in a necessary and proportionate way in the way that you deal with people's data. And so that's basically putting a kind of data protection wrap around these fundamental rights. So just to sort of touch on where GDPR impacts telecoms. And again, I mean, it's a huge, huge area that you could cover for a very long time. But there are certain areas where it has particular impact for the way that we develop products and services. So GDPR, just as a very quick one-line recap, it's a regulation, which means that it directly applies in EU member states. So you don't have to do anything to implement it. It just sits there and applies. And that's why when it came in, it was such a big deal, because it came in and that's it, it applies, and you've got to make sure that you're compliant. And since we left the EU, we have a UK version of GDPR called UK GDPR, which was similar to sort of retained European law. It's basically a snapshot of GDPR as at the point of Brexit that we apply. And the reason that we do that partly is because of the point that I raised at the bottom of the slide there, which is adequacy with European law. And I'll come on to just talk about what that means in a moment. We've also got some national legislation that sits alongside that, again, particularly relevant in the area of government powers. So certain areas where member states don't want to sort of cede authority to the European Union, like national security. Member states want to maintain control of national security for obvious reasons. And so European law says there are certain areas that you can deal with. And the Data Protection Act deals with some of those areas. So how we deal with data protection in the areas of law enforcement, and that of course applies to telecoms companies and other companies over the top providers where they are liaising with law enforcement, and other areas like the intelligence agencies and the powers that they have. And that's governed by national legislation. And then we have other laws such as privacy and electronic communications regulations, known as PECA, which is one of the more interesting acronyms. And that's basically governing how we deal specifically with security breaches and dealing with data in the area of electronic communications networks. So it sort of sits alongside GDPR and overlaps with it in certain areas. And the main area that all of this is relevant to telecoms is really in relation to how we deal with product development, as Dave was talking about, secure by design. It has an underpinning in this legislation in terms of privacy by design, as used to be called, now data protection by design default. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's an integral part to how all companies develop their products, but particularly in the area of telecom and tech, where we are specifically dealing with a lot of products that deal with data. Obviously very key to data security as well, how we manage data and how we deal with transferring, moving that data around, and security and data breaches. And just very briefly to talk about why adequacy is important in all this. So adequacy is about how we measure up against EU data protection law. So when data is transferred to the UK from the EU or the European Economic Area, whether we provide an adequate level of data protection. And obviously, in terms of business in general, that is an absolutely key question, as to whether you can move data around freely and whether you can transact and engage in commerce freely. So actually, although we've left the EU, we need very much to stay aligned with EU data protection law in a lot of areas to ensure that we keep that adequacy. And adequacy is particularly relevant to the Schrems 2 case, which I mentioned at the outset. And for those who aren't aware of what Schrems 2 was or is, it's a very important case for moving data around the world and for data transfers out of the area of Europe. A lot of businesses have had to expend a lot of resource in complying with it. And the reason for that is this. When you move data out of Europe, in order to protect individuals' privacy and their personal data, you need to have a mechanism to do that ensures that the data is protected to the same sort of level that it would be in Europe. Because of the amount of data transfer between Europe and America, the US had a particular mechanism, first called Safe Harbor and later called Privacy Shield, which basically was supposed to give that level of protection for data that was specifically traveling to the US. And Max Schrems, who's an Austrian privacy activist, brought a case against Facebook, Schrems 1 and then Schrems 2, challenging the use of those mechanisms. Because what he said essentially was the US intelligence agencies have free reign to get hold of this data if they want to. And there's very little transparency about it. I, as a data subject, cannot possibly hope to challenge that. And so I basically don't believe that these mechanisms are worth the paper that they're written on. And ultimately, the European Court of Justice agreed. It struck down Safe Harbor and later struck down Privacy Shield. And what it also said was that certain other mechanisms that are used to transfer data around, one of which is a contractual mechanism called standard contractual clauses. If you're going to rely on them, you've got to do a lot of due diligence on the country that you're sending that data to. So you've got to look at actually, what powers do their intelligence agencies have to access this data? How are you going to protect it? Are you going to encrypt it? Are you going to pseudonymize it? How are you going to ensure that the minimum amount of data is transferred? And that was a huge burden for a lot of companies. And so that's really the major impact of Schrems 2. There will be another mechanism in place for the US in due course, I've no doubt. Privacy Shield 2, whatever they want to call it. But actually the lasting legacy of this case is the amount of work that you have to do to ensure that personal data is protected when it's transferred, particularly in the context of the move to the cloud. And we've had to do a lot of work at BT with cloud providers to look at the mechanisms they put in place to protect against these powers. I've mentioned just briefly privacy and data protection by design and default. And as I say, this is the legal pinning really underpinning to a lot of what Dave was talking about in terms of security by design. GDPR went further than previous laws in formalizing how you need to basically demonstrate that you are adequately protecting data in the way that you design your products. So as they are designed, you need to build in data protection. You also need to ensure that the highest levels of protection are on by default, so that you're not opting people into things that share their personal data without their knowledge, for example. And in BT, as in common with a lot of other large organizations, as part of the, whether it's the passport mechanism or sort of more generally with concept to market processes where that's not in place, we apply privacy impact assessments and now transfer impact assessments following Schrems to ensure that we're capturing that risk and it's auditable for the future. And to come back to, I think, Conrad's question earlier, it's also where data protection impact assessments come in as well. Data protection impact assessments are looking more at where there is a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. You need to do sort of an extra layer of due diligence. It's like a privacy impact assessment plus to ensure that you're basically capturing and where possible mitigating those risks. Another area is privacy and government powers, where the government has the right to use investigatory powers to access information that companies like telecoms companies and other providers hold. And a lot of the developments in the last few years have been very much down to the disclosures by this individual, Edward Snowden. And whatever you think about what he did of him as an individual, there's no doubt that what he did had a lasting impact on the investigatory powers regime, particularly in this country and also in the US. And it brought a lot more out into the open in terms of how the intelligence agencies deal with, at a high level, with data and with privacy. I was actually a government lawyer at the time, just after all of this happened, when the first Privacy International Challenge came into our team, which was looking at challenging the hacking activities, as they're now avowed, of GCHQ. And at the time, there was nothing in the public domain, really, about the fact that GCHQ even did this. I mean, most people would have probably guessed it was doing something along those lines, because it was getting 600 million a year from the government to do something. But it was basically the first time that we actually had to draft a code of practice to say, look, in broad terms, this is when you might fall within the remit of these powers. This is when the government might look to use hacking, equipment interference, in the context of investigations. And obviously, a lot of that, ironically, has actually been driven by the growth of encryption, which has meant that the government hasn't been able to use traditional interception the same way it has looked at alternative approaches. But that was what this case was about, and a lot of information was put into the public domain. And we've seen, obviously, more recently, it's no accident that director of GCHQ, director of the Secret Intelligence Service have been in the press, on the radio, talking in a much more open way about work in this area. And so again, I mean, that a lot of this led to, I mean, there was already work being done on reform of investigatory powers, but a lot of this litigation and the principles made their way into what's now the Investigatory Powers Act. And again, a lot of people like to call it the Snoopers Charter, but it actually does move the law on quite away from what it used to be in terms of transparency and in terms of safeguards. The issue was that previously no one knew what was going on, and now that they do know a bit more about what's going on, obviously there's more public criticism of it, but actually it has put in place more safeguards. And then we had the Privacy International case, which was decided last year, which is another European case, and it's particularly relevant to telecoms providers because it governs where the government is acting under this sort of carve-out that I mentioned for national security purposes. And it basically says that other providers who might be asked to help them in this area are not able to rely on that carve-out. So if a telecoms provider is asked to assist with in the area of investigatory powers, they still have to comply with all of the European privacy law that I talked about a little bit earlier on, and those safeguards. So it's quite potentially a difficult area and an area that's fraught for challenge. Incidentally, the reason for the haystack is it was all about bulk powers, which are to do with sort of sifting through the haystack to find the needle of intelligence. As you'll be aware, with the way that the modern internet works, you can't really look at things in real time. So it's to do with the powers that governments have to hoover up information and then search through it later. So that's sort of covering the area of government powers and the area of sort of data protection. Privacy and network security is probably the other big area of legal development in the last few years. And one of the big developments just in the last, well, it's not been just in the last few weeks, but it's just come into force in the last few weeks, is the Telecoms Security Act. And that was the result of a very long-running review by DCMS, looking at a whole range of security issues, particularly related to supply chain in telecoms. So I'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the area we heard Rob talk about, which is offensive security and the Computer Misuse Act. Again, very challenging area, particularly as we move towards more cloud infrastructure. And then a bit about device security and the challenges that poses. So the Telecoms Security Act is it's a very significant piece of legislation for telecoms, and it's dealing with a whole host of different areas, including all of the stuff that we've heard about with Huawei, which is probably less related to privacy, but it's under the same umbrella. The telecoms security requirements, which are more relevant to privacy, in the sense that they require retention of signaling data for certain periods for the purposes of network security, and that they have new requirements for reporting of actually currently quite a wide range of potential security breaches and a wider range of what we might traditionally considered to be security breaches. And all of this sort of legislation that sits underneath the Act is going to be consulted on in the new year, probably through to about May next year. And then we'll see the sort of final shape of the detail, but it's something that's very much worth keeping an eye on, because it's going to have a lot of relevance to the telecoms area and anyone who's involved in public-facing networks. As I say, the key areas to look for are the sort of the role of Ofcom and the requirements for reporting significant risks of security compromise in public-facing networks, because it's currently very, very broad. And I'd certainly recommend anyone who has an interest in this area to keep an eye on the consultation and feed into it, because we certainly will be. So that's, I think, probably all that needs to be said on that for the moment. The other area, I suppose, to look at is the retention requirements for signaling data, and again, the scope of that and the the retention periods themselves. It's currently draft is 13 months, but may change. So quite a significant retention burden there potentially as well. Talk briefly about offensive security, and as I mentioned, I mean, this is obviously much wider than just penetration testing, as we heard from Rob earlier, and there's a whole host of work that we are doing at the moment to try and capture the sort of policy that we apply very broadly to this type of activity. It's from a computer side, it's relatively straightforward, although it's a problematic area of law. I mean, you cannot carry out this kind of activity on networks that you either don't control or that you don't have the permission of the network controller to do. And you can see that as we move to the cloud more and more, doing the kind of testing that we used to do on our own systems is much, much harder. Even if you can get permissions, it's how you sort of outline those permissions, exactly what you're allowed to do, given the, well, I mean, you could hear from what Rob was saying, you know, the degree of dynamism to how they approach their testing. And even once you get onto the systems, you know, the degree to which people have to mimic the bad actors and operate in the moment makes the legal wrap around that extremely challenging and very, very interesting, but it's about trying to sort of provide guardrails to either side rather than sort of say, you know, be too prescriptive about it, because it just won't work if you are. The other sort of two-pronged attack, I suppose, that we're taking to this is there has been a government consultation on the Computer Misuse Act, which we're feeding into, and looking at how we can get more defences into play for people who are doing this kind of ethical hacking work, so that there is more of a defence available to people who are doing this for beneficial purposes. Because at the moment there is basically nothing there other than your knowledge or not of whether you were authorised to do what you were doing. So I think that would be a very beneficial legal development, because all of this is required actually for the purposes of things like GDPR. You know, we have to test our networks. It's actually a legal requirement to do security testing, and that then feeds into the privacy of the users of the network. And just coming on to the sort of final a couple of slides really. I think the debate has really moved on in the last few years away from just this talk about data protection and personal data to a much wider look at how we use AI and how we use big data for the public benefit. And so we've seen developments in Europe, and there are developments in the UK as well, looking at not just how do we sort of restrict use of data and use of personal data, but how do we actually allow the free flow of data where it is for public benefit? And I suppose that's really been fed into as well recently by what we've done in the area of COVID, you know, using non-personal data, but you know, aggregated, large-scale data to help government to react in a useful way to developments, and you know, to look at sort of where people are congregating, that kind of thing. Again, nothing resolvable to individuals, but we do need to have a debate about, you know, where we appropriately use information in this way, as we can do more and more analytics on it. And the ICO is consulting on this at the moment. I think the consultation is actually finished now, but it's something that the ICO is looking very closely at. And then finally, I suppose I've just touched on a very recent bill that's come out just in the last couple of weeks, the Product Security and Telecoms Infrastructure Bill. And the product security aspect of that is just a very interesting area of tension at the moment, in the sense that you know, even within BT, we look at how we can protect consumers, our customers, in terms of helping them with device security, helping advise them on the sorts of things that they can do to protect their privacy online. And yet at the same time, we have obligations, or we will have obligations under things like the online safety bill to block access to harmful sites online, potentially, for example. And the two things don't necessarily always sit particularly comfortably alongside each other, because the more people are using, I mean, we've got used to VPNs and Tor and all of those things, but we're seeing obviously more technology coming in by way of sort of using proxies through certain browsers to obfuscate, DNS requests, that kind of thing. And the more that happens, the more that impacts the ability of us in other areas to be able to protect consumers and protect privacy, not only sort of looking at, network traffic, but also looking at things like parental controls and those kinds of things that in other areas do protect people in their use of in their online activity. So that's going to be an interesting area, I think, of development in the next few years. And I think that's the point that I sort of wanted to close on, is just to make that that point that it's not all heading in exactly the same direction, and there are areas of tension here, even between different areas of the business that both want to protect privacy. So yeah, a lot of food for thought for the next few years. But thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions now. Otherwise, I think we've got the panel coming up.
Okay. I've just got one, if I may. I thought that was really, really interesting. All sorts of things to think about in there, and I think the whole the business of privacy versus security, or privacy with security, or there are all sorts of linkages between the two there that often have to be thought through. Linking back to Bob's talk earlier, Bob was talking about a security guild. I think it was a security guild structure. Is there a similar sort of concept for privacy within BT, or do you see that emerging in other organizations? You have a privacy guild structure or a privacy governance structure that sort of oversees, and I guess how far down the chain do you take privacy down the levels, as it were? So Bob was talking earlier on about agile development, and the guys who are the devs who are doing agile development being much more hands-on with security these days. So privacy by design and default, does that go all the way down to the devs within BT, or does it sit somewhere above, perhaps at the product level, or how does that all work?
Yeah, I think the question of where assurance or different levels of assurance in this area is very much something that we're working on at the moment. I think one of the things that we've discovered really is that I mean, firstly, it's the issue of data mapping is sort of a key kind of enabler to all of this being able to happen, and so to that extent, yes, you do need to go right down into the weeds to complete that that exercise and keep completing it. I think what we've discovered is, as a function, as we sit in the wider sort of data ethics and governance function, is that as lawyers and data specialists, because it's some kind of cross-functional team, we can't manage all of that centrally, and so you do have to have data privacy champions in teams in a very similar way to the way that Bob was talking about, because you simply you can't take responsibility for doing all of that. You have to have people who are equipped and knowledgeable and have, I suppose, yes, it's that same idea of what you would used to call in a military context commander's intent. It's that sort of this is how we're going to equip you to be able to help us, yeah, so I don't think it's there yet, but it will very much be moving out into the wider business. And our function is actually relatively new in its current form, so that's a sort of a future area of development.
Hello. Does the data ethics extend to carbon footprint? Bit of a fly, I know.
I think, well, We are, I mean, we are looking at carbon footprint, and that's certainly part of the wider BT ethics policy, yes. I think in terms of data ethics, I suppose it doesn't, I don't know whether it necessarily impacts on the use of personal data so much, but yeah, certainly it's part of the wider ethics, yes, bit. Yeah.
I actually have a question, James. What do you think of external validation to be able to demonstrate compliance? I'm particularly thinking about ISO 27701, the add-on to ISO 27001, the privacy, the PIMS, I can't remember what it's called actually, but the ISMS version for privacy. Do you see that as a way forward for organizations who want to be able to demonstrate compliance in data privacy by external validation?
I mean, I think that the legislation itself is quite broad in some areas. So GDPR imposes a lot of very, I mean, deliberately broad requirements for things like, and take something like technical and organizational measures, which are what feed into the data protection by design and default sort of process. You have an obligation to impose appropriate technical and security, technical and organizational measures, taking into account the state of the art and various other factors. But it's just it's appropriate, and it's designed to sort of to move over time. So where I think those standards can help is to put something a bit more concrete and get some industry agreement as to what the state of the art is and what the what people are agreed as the current sort of best practice. I mean, whether you need an actual tick in the box to say that, I think that's for that's an open question, but certainly the standards that they produce, I think, can help to just crystallize what people agree is the current state of best practice. Because the legislation isn't always that helpful in itself.
Good. Any more questions here?
We've got a question here from our Zoom audience, from Conrad actually. What does BT see as having the higher impact? Breaches of privacy or breaches of security?
I mean, they're usually one and the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to see if certainly a major one that wouldn't impact both. So, and they're both bad. So yeah.
I've just got one more, if I may. You were talking about pen testing within cloud environments, and it just sort of pricked my ears up a little bit. So how does that work? What are the problems if you're a SaaS provider, or who do you need to get approval or authorization from if you want to test into the cloud? You want to do some pen testing and you're consuming cloud services. So do you need the authority from the CSP or from the tenant, or where do you go to get that authority to do testing, let's say, of an application running in AWS somewhere? Yeah, particularly if it's yours.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting question, and it's certainly the first question that that I asked when we were looking at similar things. And it varies. It does vary between providers. I think most of the time they do have dedicated security contacts that are responsible precisely for looking at that area, because more and more people are asking to do this. So I won't name any names in this sort of forum, but certain providers are very upfront in saying you can do this, this, and this without asking for permission. This you need to ask this permission for. This you need to give us how much notice. And also, you can potentially, if you're looking at your own tenanted area, you can set up. Some providers are much better now with setting up dedicated accounts for people like Rob's team or Rob's wider sort of team to do their work in a way that is covert for the rest of your organization, which is obviously very important. I think the really interesting area is what happens at the edge of that and the edge of your tenanted area, because actually that's partly what you're most interested in is sort of, can someone break a virtual machine? Can someone, can we push outwards? Can we, and that's where you really struggle to get sort of buy-in for completely understandable reasons. And I think also from the legal side, even if you were to get buy-in, actually drawing up the liability provisions and the scope in a way that everyone is protected to the extent that their lawyers are happy and our lawyers are happy, it's really, really tricky. So within your tenanted area, I think it's developing quite quickly and it's pretty helpful, but at the edges, that's where there's a bit more work to do.
And I think looking at where things are evolving, the big hyperscaler platforms have become more accepting of the fact that they need to be able to accommodate this. When we're moving to the world of SaaS, I think we still have a problem in the SaaS provider space, because there's, they're smaller organizations generally providing those sort of capabilities, and that's an area where you haven't quite got that same clarity. And I think in our experience of working with SaaS providers on testing them, that's still got to be explicit permission working with them. And actually, I think the best way that we've actually managed to get that to work at the moment is by almost contracting as a supplier of a penetration test to them as a capability, rather than us saying we want to test our specifics. It's probably been more successful than trying to do it direct. Yeah,
you'd almost see that as free consultancy.
Yeah,
free
precisely.
testing.
Yeah. No, we'll test you because it's in our interest to test you, and we'll share the results because you'll benefit from the results.
Yeah, really good.
I've got another question. Do you have any tie-ups with any of the other telecoms companies within the UK on the privacy field? Are there some forums you get together on?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do have legal contacts that we do discuss these issues with. The big area, obviously, that everyone has to be careful of is competition law, and making sure that we're not sort of oversharing information that might be might contravene that, or be sort of commercially sensitive in other ways. But no, generally, I think we do have a pretty open discussion, and I'm sure, yeah, in other areas of security as well. But certainly on the legal side, yeah, we have regular individual and collective catch-ups.
Are there any other questions?
No questions online.
No more questions online or in the room at the moment. We had, Deepsi's got one.
Yeah, sorry. You asked about, you said about device security. My question is about, I don't have BT devices at home, sorry. You have now home devices, BT supplied. Does it involve that we can't test it? Is there any regulations about testing them, pen testing or any other testing on those devices?
Not beyond the sort of product development, security testing that goes in before they're actually produced and shipped, and the development work that goes into it, but not post being sent out or anything. I mean,
I'm talking about a user. What sort of rights? Because I had a device a few years ago. It says you cannot, a router, you cannot test, do any experiments on this router. So I'm just wondering what is your stand on that?
I mean, in terms of, I think there's two different things going on there. I mean, in terms of the Computer Misuse Act, you have the right to test any network that you control or that you own, products that you own. I suspect that's looking more at kind of product warranties and reverse engineering and that kind of thing that you can't look into for for commercial reasons, or because it's their IP, their intellectual property patents, that sort of thing, more than because it's a Computer Misuse Act issue. So that's probably where the dividing line is.
Thank you.
I'm thinking this has been working quite well in this format, and rather than set up a panel on the stage at this point, we've got the three speakers here still in the room. If you want to come back and have a sit down, James, by all means. Does anyone have any other questions for the panel? So, as I say, rather than setting up a set of chairs at the front of the room, does anyone in the room or perhaps online have questions for our speakers, and we can zoom in on them and answer them around the table here. Just conscious of the fact that our panel session was running till 4:20, so rather than take 5 minutes to rearrange the room, we could just do it like this. Anything coming through there on the Zoom, Alan?
Whilst we wait maybe for a question coming in on Zoom, I'll maybe pick up on the guide and privacy stuff. So I think one thing that's really important, right? I mean, security by design, privacy by design. Clearly, to do privacy by design, there's a lot of commonality between the sort of controls we deploy from a security perspective and a privacy perspective, and we do, although we've presented separately, teams do work hand in glove in terms of driving those. Driving through to ensure that we're putting the right measures in place, and actually coming back to how we verify and the autonomous way we want to be able to collect that control evidence in the verify element. It's a program of work that's looking at both security control and privacy control. So we are actually hand in glove in terms of driving those elements through. I just thought I'd reinforce that that point following on from that question earlier.
And the security passport that was mentioned also has the task of the PIA built into it.
It does.
So that we sort of check between the two of us to make sure that, if a project's picked up by privacy, they say, as long as the security passport is signed off, and privacy will say, and security will say, where's the PIA? And if there isn't already a PIA, there will be one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right.
Nothing online, I'm afraid.
So nothing online then at the moment. So unless anything comes through just in the last couple of minutes, I think perhaps we could just start wrapping things up. I mean, first of all, from me, just huge thanks to you guys from BT, to Rob really for organising all of this, and to BT for allowing us to use the facility and grab some valuable time from you folks, because I know you're all very busy. So very, very much appreciated. I've taken loads of notes, and I'm sure everyone else has too. We'll distribute the slides and no doubt talk about this in our next committee meeting. As far as the BCS and the ISSG is concerned, obviously one of the aims of the BCS is to engender best practice across the whole of the industry, and I think it's sessions like today that enable us really to learn what best practice often looks like, albeit that we all then take it away and tweak it and give it our own flavor to fit in our own organization and setting. But it's been absolutely fascinating. So thanks very much indeed for all of that. The other thing I wanted to say is lots of people told me that hybrid doesn't really work. And I think today you guys have proved here at BT that hybrid can work, because we've had a good mix of questions coming in both from Zoom and from in the room. And we've got a team of AV guys over in the back here who've been driving all of this wizardry and making it all possible for us. So thanks to all of them as well for making this all happen and for proving that it can be very, very effective. I think that just about wraps it up for me. For the BCS guys and the ISSG guys, we're going to run on in about half an hour, 40 minutes to our AGM for the ISSG. So if you are a BCS member, you'd be very, very welcome to stay and participate in that. AGMs, never quite sure which way they're going to go. They can either be 10-minute jobs or 5-hour jobs. So we'll see how that goes. But we've got a question. We've got a question. But we've got a meal booked later on this evening, so hopefully it's not going to be the 5-hour one.
Yeah.
But we've got one final question, I think, to come from the Zoom contributors.
Yeah. So do you have any advice on the rollout of these things to an organization like BT, embedding and getting business people on board with security processes, verification, ownership, top-down organization, risk-driven objectives, etc.? Do you have any advice?
That's a very big and very broad question. I mean, I think so firstly, I mean, it's a major cultural shift, right, to drive some of these sort of programs out. So for an organization the size and scale of BT, I mean, the first thing I'd say is just don't underestimate the amount of effort that driving this through. We probably anticipate to get where we want to get to. Given I talked about the architectural picture as well, I mean, I think that's a multi-year investment over probably the course of the next 3 years to get us where we really want to be in an optimized way. But coming back to Bob's point, I mean, and Bob's presentation, I think we continue to see evolution of how the business is moving, the way the business is doing things. So for us, this is reapproaching relooking at our approach and evolving is in our bloodstream and adapting to the business. We have to continue to adapt. The business will continue to adapt. So I don't think this is an ending story. It'll continue to evolve. Importantly, you have to have buy-in from the top, right? So if you want to drive culture change, you want to drive a shift. I think we are very fortunate that Philip is a big supporter of getting security right for BT. And when you've got that support right from the top of the organization and the drive to push security out, it's so much easier than if you're fighting against it because you haven't got support from the top. So I think my first biggest point for anyone who wants to drive out the sort of thing that we're driving through is start with the top of the organization, demonstrate the need to drive it. There's nothing better than demonstrating the need to improve your security than either a security instance, or if you haven't had a security incident, employing the skills of someone like Rob to come in and prove why you could have a security incident if you haven't got one, because that wakes people up, and you start waking people up at the top, and then you suddenly get that drive to want to change and do something about it, because they're liable in the capabilities at the top of the organization if they're not doing the right things to keep the organization safe and secure and in compliance with the law. And of course, the new things coming in, like the Telecom Security Act, is reinforcing that even further, at least for us in the telecom sector, to ensure that we're embedding security into the stuff we do.
Yeah, brilliant. One of the things we did a year or so ago, just before the pandemic, everything seems to be either pre or post pandemic these days, doesn't it? So just pre-pandemic, we did some media training for our senior management team. So it was all around crisis management, and responding to a breach was clearly the focus of the thing. And that didn't half focus some minds as well when you put people in front of a TV camera with a reporter asking them questions about a fictitious incident, albeit, but it felt like a very, very real scenario to them, and it certainly got an awful lot of interest from the people who should care and do care. So that was really good. Any more questions? We done?
No more questions.
Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up at that point. I would just like to register my thanks to Rob, to BT, to James, to Bob, to Rob, and to Dave for their time for a fantastic afternoon, and to wish you all a safe trip home. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been a real pleasure hosting BCS here at Snow Hill today, and for those people who've been virtual remote, great to show that actually as a technology organization we can demonstrate the value of technology and hybrid working and show that it can work well, and look forward to hosting you in the future, either here at London or any of the other amazing places we're building out. So yeah,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you.